It drips, it leaks, it occasionally screams. No, that's not a haunted medieval dungeon, that's the toilet, specifically the one that hangs off the side of your castle wall like a questionable architectural afterthought. Welcome to the noble art of medieval sanitation, where luxury meant sitting in a drafty stone box 30 feet above the moat, pants around your ankles, hoping no one walks below at the wrong moment. You see in the grand designs of medieval castles with their towering spires, impenetrable walls, and murder holes. There was one problem: no amount of moats or boiling oil could solve human digestion. Kings, queens, knights, cooks, jesters, monks, and that guy who talks to goats, everyone had to go. And castles had to find a way to make that happen without turning the banquet hall into a biohazard. Enter the garderobe, a name that sounds like a fancy French wardrobe, but is in fact a literal poop chute. Carved into the stone of castle walls, these bathrooms weren't tucked away inside cozy chambers. No, they jutted out from the fortress itself, suspended high above the courtyard garden river, or in especially unlucky designs, the kitchen roof. From the outside, they looked like stone birdhouses for demons. From the inside, they were a cold stone seat with a hole. Beneath that hole, a long vertical shaft, and beneath that, gravity. No plumbing, no flushing, no mercy. The basic idea was brilliant in its brutality: drop waste out of the castle. Let it fall, hope for the best. The garderobe gave medieval nobles the satisfaction of literally crapping on their enemies, or their servants, or the occasional squirrel. It was the kind of system that said, yes, we have siege defenses, and yes, we also believe in free-falling feces. But this wasn't just about efficiency, it was about status. Having a private garderobe meant you were important. The king had one. The lord had one. Even some higher-ranked servants had access to their own air-conditioned porcelain-free thrones. And where were these thrones located? Often high up near sleeping quarters or towers carefully angled so the business end didn't drop onto walkways. Unless, of course, you had guests you didn't like. Some castles even had multiple garderobes in a row, like a medieval public restroom, but without doors or dignity. And cleaning them. Oh, that was someone's full-time job. Castle gong farmers were tasked with scraping out the cesspits below, often under cover of night, because the smell could cause spontaneous regret. They worked with shovels, buckets, and the kind of facial expressions that say, I made a series of bad life choices. And no, they were not paid enough. But hey, they were technically essential workers. And in some towns they earned surprisingly good coin if you considered tetanus and public humiliation a form of compensation. Back inside the castle, garderobes weren't just waste removal devices. They were also used to store clothing. Yes, you heard that right. People hung their finest cloaks and linens near the toilet. Why? Because the fumes were believed to repel moths. That's right. Medieval logic dictated that if the smell could make a grown man weep, it could definitely kill a bug. And so lords would step into their garderobe, do their business, and maybe pick up a fresh tunic on the way out. Efficient, unhygienic, peak medieval multitasking. Now let's address the elephant in the chamber: safety. These things were not built with comfort in mind. There were no railings, no soft seats, no toilet paper. You sat on cold stone with your back to a wall and your dignity on the line. One wrong shift, and you could join your waist on its journey downward. And yes, there are tales, likely exaggerated, but still horrifying, of people falling through, slipping in, or being pushed. It was a literal throne of danger. Some garderobes were even accessed through trapdoors in bedrooms. You'd lift a wooden plank squat and pray to every known saint that your aim was true and your balance steady. Because nothing ruins a good night's sleep like dropping your foot into yesterday's sins. And let's not forget the winter. A castle was already a cold, drafty stone box, but the garderobe. That was the North Pole's evil cousin. No insulation, no warmth, just you, your bare backside, and a January breeze strong enough to freeze time. Nobles endured it because complaining was reserved for peasants. Peasants, meanwhile, dug holes, used buckets, or just said screw it, and fertilized the fields directly. Honestly, they might have had the better system. But in castles, garderobes were part of the architecture, designed into the very walls. Some had wooden seats. Some had double holes for company. Some emptied into moats, creating a delicate ecosystem of fish frogs and human regret. And yes, invaders sometimes had to climb up those waste chutes to breach the walls. That's not just warfare, that's psychological trauma. So the next time you walk into a restroom, take a moment. Appreciate the door, the plumbing, the lack of wind, the fact that nobody is walking beneath you with an open mouth. Because in the Middle Ages, the bathroom wasn't a room. It was a gamble. A hanging stone cubicle of hope and horror. A reminder that no matter how grand the castle, how noble the lineage, or how expensive the robe, everyone poops. And sometimes they do it from the side of a building. No one in medieval Europe woke up and thought, "Today I want to walk normally." That would be peasant behavior. If you were among the wealthy elite, comfort was the enemy. Practicality was for people who had to work for a living. The rich. They needed to make an entrance, and nothing screamed, "I'm nobility, and I know it like shoes with toes so long they could double as jousting lances." They were called poulains, and they were everything. Modern sneakers are not dangerous, stupid, and utterly fabulous. These weren't just shoes, these were weapons of class distinction. If you wore poulains, you weren't trying to get anywhere fast. You were trying to be seen. You were trying to silently scream, "Look at me, for I have never dug a ditch, milked a goat," or done anything that required balance or dignity. The longer the toe of your shoe, the more important you were. That was the rule. If your shoes were 6 inches long, you were upper middle class. 10 inches, high nobility. 2 feet, you were either royalty or a certified ankle-hating maniac. And yes, there were actual people who wore poulains that extended over 2 feet beyond their real toes. These shoes were so long they had to be tied to the wearer's knees with chains just to prevent spontaneous death by footwear. This was fashion as performance art. Wait, no, don't imagine. You're there. You're a wealthy duke in a chilly stone castle. You've just been invited to a feast by Lord de something or other. You have 2 choices, your short, comfortable indoor shoes, or your 2-foot-long velvet-tipped poulains that glitter in the candlelight. Obviously, you go with the poulains. Never mind the icy flagstones. Never mind the narrow stairs. Never mind that your manservant is literally walking ahead of you with a broom to clear the path so you don't trip on a loose beet. What matters is that when you step into that hall, people gasp not because of your titles, not because of your sword, but because of the aerodynamic audacity of your footwear. But the real tragedy, no one ever admits how deeply stupid this all was. In public, everyone kept a straight face. They nodded in approval. They offered compliments like, "Ah, the Count of Artois," ever the trendsetter, when they really wanted to say, "How do you urinate in those?" But society had rules, and one of them was that if you were rich, you could wear whatever you wanted, no matter how catastrophic for your spinal alignment. Naturally, these shoes weren't cheap. They were made of fine leather, dyed in obnoxious colors like crimson and peacock blue, sometimes embroidered with gold thread, or studded with tiny bells, because when you walk like a penguin, you may as well jingle like one, too. And just like modern fashion, the peasants were watching. They couldn't wear poulains. It was literally illegal for them to do so in some towns, but you can bet they had opinions. Ah yes, they would say, while ankle-deep in mud, "Look at Lord Wigglefoot walking like he's never known fear." Or stairs. But the most baffling part wasn't the length. It was how normalized this all became. There were tailors whose entire careers revolved around making longer and longer shoes for increasingly unhinged nobles. There were competitions, subtle ones, social ones, a sort of foot-based Cold War. Baron Duclos showed up with 16-inch poulains last week, one noble would whisper. "We must outdo him, ready the rhinestones." It became a cycle. The longer the shoes, the more assistance you needed. The more assistance, the more wealth you projected. And suddenly you had a whole class of people whose job it was just to prevent their employer from dying on the way to dinner. You haven't lived until you've watched a grown man in a silk doublet scream because his poulains got caught in a garden fence. The church, of course, had opinions. Because if there's one thing medieval Christianity excelled at, it was judging footwear. Church leaders condemned poulains as vain, excessive, and dangerously phallic. Yes, that was actually a concern. Some sermons ranted about how the devil could enter the soul through the tips of one's shoes, which honestly seems like a very specific logistical problem. But the church had power, and sometimes they even got laws passed. In England, Edward IV issued a law in 1463 restricting the length of shoe points to 2 inches for anyone below the rank of a lord. This was the medieval equivalent of banning designer logos in public schools. The elite naturally ignored it. Because what's the point of wealth if you can't look like you're about to take flight every time you walk? But eventually, like all fashion palanes, fell out of favor. People got tired of breaking ankles. Trends shifted. Some say it was the rise of practical military footwear. Others blame the plague. You can't outrun death with 2 feet of leather dragging behind you. Whatever the reason, by the late 15th century, the noble classes decided they'd rather live than look cool, and the age of the pointy toe faded into the background of history's fashion blooper reel. Still, the spirit of the poulain lives on. In every pair of sky-high heels that make a runway model teeter like a baby giraffe. In every celebrity outfit that defies physics, taste, and temperature. We may have evolved past the toe lances, but we've never evolved past the urge to say, I am above you, and here's the ridiculous thing I'm wearing to prove it. So the next time you see someone wearing an outfit that looks like it escaped from a Renaissance-themed fever dream, don't scoff. Pay homage. That's not just eccentric fashion. That's legacy. That's tradition. That's a noble lineage of humans choosing discomfort over dignity, extravagance over ergonomics, and making every single step a slow, glorious disaster. Poulains weren't shoes. They were medieval mic drops. They didn't whisper wealth. They screamed it with a honk, a jingle, and possibly a loud thud when their wearer tripped over a duck. Wake up! It's 6 a.m. The rooster's screaming like he just saw your tax bill. You've got to haul wood feed, animals survive plague season, and oh yes, do it all without crying. But wait, before any of that, what's for breakfast? Porridge and eggs, fresh fruit. No, my historically confused friend, you're having beer. And not just a sip, a whole jug, maybe 2, because nothing says I'm ready to face the horrors of feudal life like knocking back a pint before sunrise. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where water was suspicious, beer was salvation, and nobody thought it was weird that Grandma could outdrink the village blacksmith by 9 a.m. Now, before you go picturing medieval folk day drinking like frat boys on homecoming weekend, let's be clear, this wasn't your hoppy IPA swirling artisan nonsense with flavor notes of pretension. This was small beer, a low-alcohol, watery bread-flavored soup masquerading as a beverage. It was the breakfast smoothie of the 14th century, except with more yeast and fewer antioxidants. And it was everywhere. Children drank it, monks brewed it, kings demanded it, even nuns had secret recipes. Because when you live in a world where dysentery lurks in every puddle, beer isn't a luxury, it's your immune system in liquid form. Water was often pulled straight from streams, generously seasoned with livestock waste, and that one guy upstream who just didn't care anymore. So people did the only logical thing. They boiled water, added grains, fermented it into barely boozy soup, and called it breakfast. Was it delicious? Not exactly. Was it safer than dysentery? Absolutely. Was it the beginning of Europe's love affair with being slightly buzzed before sunrise? Without question. In fact, brewing became one of the most important domestic skills a household could possess. Want to impress your neighbors? Don't show off your tapestry, offer them your wife's finest breakfast brew. Want to get a job in a monastery? Better know how to balance prayer with pale ale. Even taxes could be paid in beer. Medieval accountants would literally show up and be like, we'll take 3 goats, a bag of turnips, and a keg of whatever that hazy stuff is fermenting in your basement. And people would nod. Because yes, that was currency, that was economics, that was civilization. But let's pause a moment and take this seriously. Can you even imagine waking up today, brushing your teeth, and immediately reaching for a pint of beer? Your dentist would cry, your HR manager would schedule an intervention. Yet back then it was just hydration. Kids drank it before school. Yes, school where they would go to memorize Latin and learn why everyone was burning heretics again. Workers drank it before operating medieval death machines like spinning wheels, grindstones, or that one drawbridge pulley system designed by a sadist. Even monks, those paragons of restraint, would start their day with a pint followed by another at lunch and another in the evening, which honestly explains a lot about medieval illuminated manuscripts. Have you seen those things? Flying pigs, rabbits stabbing knights, fish in robes preaching to peasants. It's like a fever dream brought to you by a man who's had 6 beers and too much ink. And let's not forget the nobles. While peasants were guzzling barley smoothies in wooden mugs, the rich were importing wines and ales so fancy they probably required a musical prelude before consumption. Some of them had cellars deeper than their family trees. Their feasts began with fermented honey wine and ended with servants dragging them out by the ankles. Yet still they would judge the peasants for drinking in the morning, because nothing says hypocrisy like sipping mead out of a goblet shaped like a dragon while muttering "Tisk commoners." But the real beauty of breakfast beer wasn't just in its practicality, it was in the ritual, the community, the shared understanding that life was hard, disease was constant, war was inevitable, and sometimes the only thing you could count on was the yeasty embrace of a warm, slightly flat pint. Families would brew together, friends would toast before farming, and old men would argue about whose brew gave fewer stomach cramps. It was culture. It was connection. It was the medieval version of your morning coffee, but replaced the barista with your grandmother, the cafe with a barn, and the foam art with floating grains. And while you might think this was all quaint, simple, or hilarious, remember this: beer kept people alive. It provided calories, hydration, and just enough numbing to make you forget that the Black Death was casually strolling through town like a door-to-door salesman. So next time someone tells you that modern people are soft, remind them that medieval toddlers drank beer, built fences, and probably survived 3 plagues before their 10th birthday. And you complain when your oat milk isn't frothed. We've come a long way, but we've also lost something. Something pure. Something foamy. Something slightly tangy and questionably fermented. Maybe the real breakfast of champions isn't eggs or toast or protein shakes. Maybe it's looking mortality in the face, hoisting a clay mug and saying, "Good morning, despair. I'll deal with you after my 2nd pint." Cheers to that. You're a medieval noble, living your best stone-walled life in a castle precariously perched on a hill so steep, goats are applying for workers' comp. You want a snack. Nothing too extravagant, maybe some spiced boar and an entire roasted pheasant with 3 kinds of gravy. But alas, the kitchens are located 5 floors down, across a drawbridge past the screaming cook, and behind a door that probably hasn't been oiled since Charlemagne was a toddler. So, what do? Do you walk? Don't be ridiculous. You summon your medieval elevator. Yes, elevators existed. No, they were not powered by buttons or gears or convenient laws of physics. They were powered by people, real living wheezing humans. Welcome to the world of medieval elevators, where your rise to the top came not from ambition or merit, but from literally standing inside a wooden box while some poor soul hamster wheeled you upward like a sack of regret. These devices were architectural fever dreams. They were massive wooden wheels, think hamster wheels for humans, attached to ropes and pulleys and installed in castles, abbeys, or anywhere a rich person decided stairs were for the weak. The idea was simple. Someone got inside, the wheel walked endlessly in place, and thus hoisted you and your noble derriere to the next floor. And no, the person inside didn't get hazard pay. They got blisters, back pain, and maybe a moldy turnip if they were lucky. But let's back up and admire the sheer chaotic brilliance of this. In a world where candles were a fire hazard and bathing was considered a luxury, someone said, what if we put Jenkins in a giant wheel and have him walk in circles until Lady Esmeralda reaches her bedroom? That was considered innovation. And it worked, sort of. Medieval elevators weren't just for nobles too important to climb stairs. They were also used in monasteries, churches, and fortresses where goods needed lifting. Barrels of ale, sacks of grain, boxes of manuscripts, even lazy monks with gout. Anything that couldn't climb went into the lift. And somewhere inside, a man named Jeffrey trudged like a sweaty hamster, re-evaluating his life choices one revolution at a time. The mechanism itself was deceptively clever. Large tread wheels, sometimes up to 10 feet wide, were installed vertically. The person inside would walk, causing the wheel to turn, winding a rope around a spool and lifting the attached platform. Sounds straightforward. Except it wasn't, because ropes snapped, wheels jammed, people fainted. And medieval engineering didn't exactly come with OSHA guidelines or safety rails. So, yes, Jeffrey sometimes fell out. And yes, occasionally a noble would be halfway up when the system failed, resulting in what historians generously call unexpected descents. But the system persisted. Why? Because the alternative was effort. Nobles weren't going to climb stairs if they could instead be hauled like sacks of flour by underpaid serfs. And those serfs weren't going to unionize because they were too dizzy from spinning inside the wheel. It was the perfect system, inefficient, dangerous, and classist, everything medieval society adored. But perhaps the most entertaining part wasn't the mechanics. It was the optics. Imagine visiting a castle and watching a countess in full velvet regalia slowly ascend toward the dining hall in a rattling wooden platform hoisted skyward by a man sweating bullets inside a creaky wheel, all while a lute player provides awkward background music. That's not just a transportation method, that's theater. And it wasn't just for people. Some castles used treadwheel cranes to build their own walls, meaning humans literally powered the construction of fortresses from inside wooden torture circles of cardio. They hauled stone timber and sometimes entire cannonballs, all while walking in place, like tragic medieval peloton instructors. And monks weren't exempt either. Some monasteries, especially those on high cliffs or isolated islands, relied on human-powered lifts to bring up supplies. You'd think a life of prayer would protect you from wheel duty, but no, Brother Thomas still got shoved into the wheel every Tuesday so he could raise the abbot's cheese stash. Now, fast forward to today. We have elevators that talk play music and politely open when you press a button. But we've also become helpless. The power goes out and we stand in lobbies like lost children. The elevator isn't working. What do we do? In the Middle Ages, they knew. You shove a man in a wheel, yell at him to walk, and hope the platform doesn't splinter halfway up. And yes, it worked. Not well, not safely. But effectively enough to lift rich people a few stories higher so they could continue believing gravity was something that only applied to peasants. So what does this all tell us? That medieval society was inventive, yes, but also gloriously absurd. They could build cathedrals that touched the sky, but couldn't conceive of a system that didn't involve one dude walking in place for 6 hours. That the idea of mechanical labor was so foreign, they just kept using more humans. That every technological advance still relied on someone named Arnold, sweating inside a wooden contraption, hoping his lunch didn't come back up. And somehow it worked. Castles were lifted, barrels were raised, nobles were transported. The wheel turned and medieval society spun right along with it, one poor guy at a time. So the next time you step into an elevator and press floor 5, think of Jeffrey. Think of Brother Thomas. Think of the countless medieval men who walked in circles so someone else didn't have to. They didn't have motors. They didn't have brakes. They had blistered feet, wooden wheels, and the crushing weight of nobility. Yelling, "Faster, peasant, I have pheasant to eat." And that, dear viewer, is how medieval elevators worked by turning class hierarchy into literal rotation. The candle flickers. The monk squints. A drop of wax hits his parchment. He mutters a curse in Latin that loosely translates to, "This job sucks." And across the stone hallway nestled in the monastery's grandest room, the library, a shelf creaks gently. Not from the wind, but from a book literally chained to the wall. Welcome to the intellectual paranoia of the medieval world, where books were so rare, so precious, and apparently so criminally seductive that librarians locked them up like dangerous felons. And not metaphorically, literally. They shackled them to shelves like they expected the manuscripts to sprout legs and sprint toward freedom the moment no one was looking. Because in medieval Europe, if you wanted knowledge, you had to fight for it, or at least unbolt it. Let's rewind. Books in the Middle Ages were not casually mass-produced paperbacks with foldable covers and twilight quotes. They were painstakingly hand-copied by monks who lived off boiled cabbage and existential dread. A single book could take months, sometimes years, to transcribe. Parchment was made from animal skin, ink was brewed like a toxic stew, and illuminations, those fancy, colorful doodles around the margins, required an entire team of stressed-out scribes with questionable eyesight and zero dental care. So a book wasn't just a source of knowledge, it was a sacred artifact, a luxury item, a flex. And if one went missing, it wasn't, oops, someone misplaced it. It was call the bishop and prepare the excommunication rituals. Because theft wasn't just probable, it was inevitable. People loved stealing books, monks, students, priests, probably even nuns. And they didn't steal them to sell because nobody could afford them. They stole them to read, or hoard, or smugly display in their candlelit rooms to impress potential intellectual suitors. So libraries fought back the only way they knew how. They chained the books down, literally attached iron chains to the covers and locked them to horizontal rods bolted into shelves or desks. The result? Libraries that looked less like sanctuaries of learning and more like torture chambers for paper. Want to read something? Great. Just sit awkwardly close to the shelf, hunch your body into a medieval pretzel, and strain your neck like a goose trying to read a street sign. Turning pages was a delicate dance. You couldn't pull the book off the shelf, it didn't reach. You couldn't spin it around chains too tight. You couldn't even close it properly unless you knew the chain choreography. This wasn't reading. This was a workout. But to be fair, the logic was solid. Books were vulnerable. Fire moisture rats, clueless monks who used them as cutting boards, all were threats. But the biggest threat, human curiosity. Students in particular were notorious for borrowing books and conveniently forgetting to return them. Universities had to resort to public shaming. Thou shalt not steal wasn't just a commandment. It was written inside the book itself, sometimes accompanied by curses like, "May the hand that steals this book wither and fall off." Not kidding. Some scribes cursed future thieves with eternal damnation. That's right. You steal this, you go to hell. With that level of spiritual customer service, it's a wonder the chains weren't made of holy relics. And yet people still tried. In fact, several chained libraries had secret logs of missing books, complete with descriptions like "last seen" with Brother Gregory, who now mysteriously has a new study chamber, and suspiciously well-illuminated gospel scrolls. The irony, most people couldn't even read. Literacy was a luxury. If you were a peasant, your chances of reading anything beyond help wanted, plague cleanup were slim. Latin was the dominant language of writing, and unless you were clergy or royalty adjacent, you probably assumed books were magical curse boxes anyway. So, who were these books chained from other elites? Which means the entire medieval library system was built on a foundation of mutual mistrust between educated people. Nothing says intellectual culture like, "Here's a priceless manuscript about divine wisdom. Don't touch it." Seriously. We bolted it to the desk. Step back. Of course, the design had side effects. Ever try to take notes from a chained book? You can't. The chain's too short, the candlelight's uneven, the quill's leaking, and God help you if your book is on the top shelf. Some libraries had ladders for that, but most just had monks with good knees and low self-preservation instincts. And yes, sometimes people still tried to steal them by cutting the chains, sawing the desk, or straight up smuggling out loose pages hidden inside their robes. The medieval black market for book pages was real. Some traders dealt in single chapters, like it was contraband. I'll trade you one Psalms for a half-burnt copy of Aristotle. No questions asked. And speaking of Aristotle, many ancient Greek texts only survived because Islamic scholars preserved and copied them while Europe was busy chaining Bibles to shelves and arguing over whether bathing caused spiritual decay. It wasn't until the printing press arrived that things finally started to change. Once books could be mass-produced, the need for chaining vanished faster than a scribe at bath time. Libraries slowly unshackled their collections, and for the first time in centuries, you could read without needing a locksmith. But some chained libraries still survive today. The most famous Hereford Cathedral Library in England still displaying its volumes behind bars, like a zoo for old paper. It's a powerful reminder that knowledge, like everything else in the Middle Ages, was heavily guarded, painfully slow, and oddly metallic. So the next time you walk into a modern library, grab a book and casually flip through it while sipping overpriced coffee. Take a moment. Remember the monks who spent 3 years copying that same book by hand. Remember the chains, the curses, the passive-aggressive Latin guilt trips written into the margins. And remember, in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to read, you didn't just need time, you needed tools, tolerance, and possibly divine forgiveness. Splash. A sound no one wants to hear near a medieval drawbridge, followed by a low growl, some panicked yelling in Old French, and the distinct silence that usually accompanies someone realizing they've lost a foot. Welcome to the unexpectedly reptilian corner of medieval defense strategy. Crocodiles in the royal moat, because when it came to keeping out peasants, enemies, and overly confident in-laws, medieval rulers didn't just rely on walls, boiling oil, or arrows the size of a small tree. They sometimes said, "What if we just threw in some literal monsters?" Now, before you roll your eyes and mutter something like, "That can't possibly be true," let's clarify. Yes, there are historical references, scattered vague and slightly unhinged, that suggest a handful of truly eccentric medieval elites might have at one point or another tried to stock their moats with crocodiles. Not many, not often, but enough to earn a chapter in the grand catalog of medieval madness. And honestly, why not? The logic, in a weirdly brilliant way, kind of tracks. A moat is already a deterrent. It's wet, it's wide, it smells like every bad decision a knight has ever made, but add a few prehistoric-looking death lizards. Now you've got yourself psychological warfare. Would-be attackers don't just have to cross a river, they have to not get turned into a chew toy. And even if the crocodiles didn't actually attack anyone, which, let's be honest, they probably didn't, crocs are lazy. Just the rumor was enough. Picture the scene. 2 enemy scouts approaching a castle, whispering about siege ladders and surprise assaults, when suddenly one of them points and says, "Hey, did that log just blink?" Boom. Instant morale collapse. No one wants to be the first guy to test whether that moat is a metaphor or a buffet. But let's step back. Where, in the name of St. Flatulence, did these crocodiles even come from? After all, Europe is not exactly known for its abundance of large aquatic reptiles, and this is where trade ambition and good old-fashioned medieval flexing come into play. In the high medieval period, exotic animals were the ultimate status symbol. Forget gold, forget jewels. You want to impress someone, show them a lion or a giraffe, or, if you're particularly insane and recently returned from the Crusades, a crocodile. Royals collected animals like modern influencers, collect skincare routines excessively and for no clear reason. England's Henry III famously kept a polar bear in the Tower of London. Yes, a polar bear, which was occasionally allowed to swim in the Thames, probably while locals screamed and prayed. So is it really that hard to believe that somewhere some noble got hold of a crocodile and thought, let's just toss it in the moat and see what happens? Of course, keeping a crocodile in a castle moat came with logistical challenges. For one, crocodiles are tropical. Europe is not. So unless you've got a moat that doubles as a hot tub, your royal reptile is going to be very cold, very confused, and very dead by winter. Feeding it would also be a problem. Crocs don't eat hay, they eat meat. And not the dried, salted stuff either. They like it fresh, flailing, preferably screaming. Which means your options are a livestock B, condemned prisoners, or C, extremely unlucky fish. Let's not think too hard about which one medieval nobles went with. Sanitation was another issue. Moats already weren't clean. They often doubled as open sewage trenches, which meant the crocodile wasn't just a terrifying beast, it was also a floating symbol of everyone's poor life choices. If it didn't eat you, the waterborne diseases probably would. It was like nature's way of saying, congratulations, you survived the fangs. Now enjoy the dysentery. Still, there's something poetic about it. The idea that a medieval lord, after fortifying his walls, posting archers, and inventing 3 different types of boiling oil, looks out at his castle and thinks, you know what's missing? A dinosaur. That's the kind of unhinged energy that built empires, or at least mildly traumatized a few messengers. And then there's the symbolism. Crocodiles were exotic, powerful, terrifying, and entirely misunderstood. Medieval bestiaries, those weird illustrated animal books full of half-truths and full-volume panic, often portrayed crocodiles as demons in disguise. Some said they cried fake tears to lure in prey. Others claimed they could climb trees. One manuscript suggested they whispered lies into people's ears while they slept. Basically, if you didn't understand an animal in the Middle Ages, you just assumed it was evil and moved on. So putting a crocodile in your moat wasn't just defense, it was a statement, a flex, a message. It said, I control nature, I command death. Also, my garden is full of screaming frogs, and while most castles probably didn't house crocodiles, the idea of it caught on. It appeared in art, in myths, in confused Latin footnotes. The rumor alone gave castles a reputation, much like how having a guard dog sign works even if the dog is actually a 3-legged pug. The illusion is half the battle. So the next time you walk past a castle ruin and see a dried-up moat filled with moss and regrets, try to picture it at its peak. Picture the banners flying, the torches, burning the nobles, shouting, the jester crying. And there beneath the drawbridge, a pair of eyes in the water, watching, waiting, probably asleep. Because, let's be honest, this was less about protection and more about drama, about flair, about the noble tradition of solving every problem with something that bites. Because in the grand medieval hierarchy of castle defense, somewhere between the archer and the catapult, there was the crocodile. Step inside a medieval church. The air smells faintly of incense mildew and peasant anxiety. A baby's crying somewhere. Someone's praying in Latin they don't understand. And as your eyes adjust to the dim candlelight, you look up and bam, there's a 12-foot-tall painting of a demon gleefully shoving people into a flaming mouth. Welcome to Sunday School, 14th Century Edition. Because in the Middle Ages, when it came to teaching morality, priests didn't just preach it, they painted it 6 meters high in full technicolor horror directly onto the sacred walls of your local church. Why simple? Most people couldn't read. So if you wanted the villagers to understand that gluttony was bad and hell was worse, you didn't hand them a Bible. You handed them trauma, vivid, permanent pigment-based trauma, and the walls. They remembered everything. Churches were the visual PowerPoint presentations of medieval morality. Each fresco, each mural, each strangely proportioned angel was a slide in a celestial TED Talk titled, How Not to Burn Forever. You think today's religious memes are aggressive. Try showing up for Mass and being greeted by a wall-sized image of a bloated man being roasted by demons while a skeleton plays the flute in the background. Subtlety was not the goal. These weren't your polite Renaissance cherubs. These were monsters, torment, and eternal consequences. And to be fair, it kind of worked. People were terrified. In a world where 80% of the population couldn't write their name, images were everything. A picture was worth 1,000 sermons, especially if it included a goat-headed devil tap dancing on a corrupt merchant. These wall paintings were called doom paintings because apparently branding wasn't subtle either. The most famous ones sat above the chancel arch, the big wall dividing the holiest part of the church from the peasants who still smelled like turnips. And what did they depict? The Last Judgment. Christ in the middle, the saved souls floating upwards like holy helium balloons, and the damned being dragged down into a demon's mouth big enough to park a wagon in. And let's be clear, this was not allegorical, this was literal. The message was, do good or this happens to you. And the this included people being boiled alive, flayed with fish hooks, force-fed molten gold, and occasionally chased by what looks like a giant chicken with teeth. Because medieval artists, God bless them, had the theological training of a monk and the subtlety of a metal concert poster. They took biblical concepts like judgment and eternal punishment and cranked them up to Nightmare Factory. And don't think they stopped at hell. Oh no. Heaven was also depicted just significantly less exciting. Heaven was usually a bunch of polite people in robes standing awkwardly around Jesus, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Everyone's expression said, "We're happy to be here, but the catering is weak." Meanwhile, on the hell side, there was fire torture, dramatic poses, and a demon DJing on a wheel of suffering. Guess which side got more attention? Now, some churches got extra creative. In one, a mural showed a greedy bishop being dragged into hell while still holding his money bag. In another, a glutton was being eaten by pigs. In yet another, women were being punished for vanity by having snakes bite their faces while mirrors floated nearby just in case they forgot to feel ashamed. These images weren't just fear-mongering, they were public service announcements. They were designed to keep people in line. Steal from your neighbor, that's a pitchfork in the butt. Gossip too much. Say hello to the demon with flaming eyebrows. Arrive late to church. You might not make it past the judgment cloud. And don't even ask what happens if you skip Mass entirely. Spoiler, it involves fire. A lot of fire. And let's take a moment to appreciate the artistry here. These weren't just scribbles. These were full-on frescoes painted by monks, journeymen, and artists with names like Brother Adelhard, the slightly colorblind. They ground their own pigments, mixed their own plaster, and climbed scaffolds with the grace of a drunken goat, all to ensure that little village kids would spend their formative years staring at demons with 6 arms and a fondness for ironic punishments. And the best part, these murals were often placed where everyone could see them. You didn't have to squint. You didn't need a priest to interpret. The message was literally written on the wall, behave or be barbecued. Even the illiterate got the point, and it wasn't just the walls. Sometimes the ceilings joined in with images of saints, martyrs, apocalyptic beasts, and whatever else the artist could dream up after a long night of wine and questionable theological discussion. In one church, there's a ceiling painting of Christ holding a sword and looking mildly disappointed. In another, there's an angel playing a trumpet directly into someone's ear, because subtle spiritual guidance was overrated. Eventually, the Reformation rolled around, and all this got a bit awkward. Protestants were like, maybe less fire and brimstone murals and more Bible reading. So many churches whitewashed the walls, covering up the art with thick coats of theological denial. But centuries later, restoration crews started peeling back the paint and gasped. Underneath the plain white surfaces were medieval fever dreams in full color, forgotten demons resurrected, and today some of these church wall paintings have become tourist attractions. Visitors wander in, expecting serenity, and instead come face to face with a horned monster chewing on a banker. And they say, wow, they really didn't hold back? No, they didn't. Because in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to teach morality, you didn't rely on abstract ideas. You painted consequences, big ones, in red with teeth. So the next time you walk past a clean white wall and think, this could use some art, remember in the 1300s they thought the same thing. And then they painted a man being swallowed by a sin-eating lizard while angels politely applauded. And honestly, maybe they had a point. Wake up, it's Tuesday. You've got chores, your cow is giving you attitude, and the local baron wants taxes in the form of eggs again. But wait, what's this? The church bell is ringing. There's incense. People are putting on their good rags. Someone's dragging out a loaf of vaguely bread-like substance shaped like a saint's femur. Congratulations. It's a holy day. Again. That's the 4th one this week. Welcome to medieval Europe, where calendars were less about productivity and more about commemorating every possible miracle martyrdom and mildly sacred anecdote anyone could scribble into a manuscript. In today's world, we get national holidays sprinkled across the year like reluctant seasoning. A few long weekends, a major event or two, and that's it. But in the Middle Ages, no, these people turned their calendar into the spiritual equivalent of a pizza with 600 toppings. Every single day, literally every single day, had at least one saint, often 2 or 3. Some days were so holy they had to overlap like sacred Tetris. The result, a year where almost 1/3 of the days were official days of rest, fasting, parading, or panicking in honor of someone who may or may not have ever existed. And here's the kicker: most medieval peasants loved it. Sure, they had to fast. Sure, some holy days involved walking barefoot through goat dung to reenact an obscure apostolic vision. But the trade-off: no work in the fields, no weeding, no carting hay up a hill in the rain. You got to stand around, chant, maybe get a bit of bread and beer and go home knowing God approved of your day off. Productivity. Huh. That's for Protestants and the Industrial Revolution. Medieval Catholicism was more like, let us honor the martyr who sneezed in Antioch by not working for 3 days and lighting candles made from 40% wax and 60% superstition. Some of the saints celebrated were actual heavyweights: St. Peter, St. Mary, St. George doing his scaly dragon thing. But others questionable. You had saints for toothaches, livestock lost keys, spilled ink, awkward foot fungus, and general anxiety, though they called it demonic oppression back then. If a monk could invent a reason to celebrate it, it was on the calendar. And local churches got creative. If your town had a relic, a finger, a toe, a sandal that might have touched someone vaguely apostolic, you had your own feast day. And if your relic glowed, bled, or even smelled nice, well, then you threw a week-long festival complete with miracle reenactments, puppet shows, and that one guy who always dressed as the devil for some reason and got too into character. These weren't quiet ceremonies. Holy days meant processions through muddy streets, children in saint costumes with disturbingly adult levels of theological trauma, entire pigs roasted in public squares, and drunken monks trying to harmonize Latin chants they barely remembered. And this was normal. Entire towns would grind to a halt because someone found a mysterious stain on the wall that looked vaguely like St. Cuthbert's elbow. Bishops would get involved. Pilgrims would arrive. Merchants would sell overpriced relic-themed keychains, or whatever the 13th century version of that was. And suddenly Tuesday turned into a week-long sacred observance. Even kings had to play along. Royal courts would schedule campaigns around feast days. Sorry, we'll invade next Thursday. It's St. Gertrude's Day, and we don't want to offend the patron saint of cheese-making widows. And don't forget the Sabbath's ember days, vigils, and octaves. Octaves were entire weeks following certain holy days. That's right, sometimes the celebration after the celebration got its own celebration. At this point, the medieval calendar wasn't a system of dates. It was a sacred excuse generator. Why aren't you harvesting? Can't. It's the feast of Saint Unpronounceable. He died in 638 by tripping over a holy goat. We honor his sacrifice by playing drums and avoiding manual labor. But of course, with great sanctity comes great loopholes. The church, realizing things were getting out of hand, started categorizing holy days. Some were obligatory, some were optional, some were high feast days, while others were just commemorations. This allowed priests to do theological gymnastics like, yes, it's St. Pius the slightly burnt today, but we'll only do a half-mass and a small procession. You can go back to sheep herding after lunch. But still there were so many. Entire medieval manuscripts were dedicated just to listing them, not explaining them, just listing them. Saint this, martyr that, virgin so-and-so, a bishop who translated psalms into pidgin Latin, and they weren't even evenly spaced. Sometimes you'd get 6 feast days in a row, and then a blessed 2-week dry spell where actual work happened. But mostly, it was stop-start chaos. And the fasting. Oh, the fasting. Holy days didn't always mean food and fun. Sometimes they meant absolutely no meat, no eggs, no dairy, no anything vaguely enjoyable, which led to some impressively creative culinary loopholes. No meat, no problem. Let's fry eels into sausage shapes and pretend it counts. There were even monks who classified beavers as fish so they could eat them on fast days. Because medieval theology may have been strict, but it also loved a good technicality. Eventually, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the 9-to-5 grind came along and crushed the great medieval holiday parade under the weight of calendars, clocks, and capitalism. But the echoes remain. Many of today's Catholic feast days, public holidays, and oddly specific festivals. Looking at you, St. Isidore the Farmer. Day are medieval leftovers, cold reheated remnants of a time when life was short. Death was common, and any excuse to not shovel manure was considered divine. So the next time you sigh and wait 3 months for your next national holiday, remember your medieval counterpart had already taken 7 feast days, 3 processions, and a fasting vigil in the same month. And they were probably better rested for it. Maybe confused, maybe malnourished, but spiritually booked and blessed. You're a medieval teenager. Hormones are doing their usual medieval chaos. You've just spotted a flaxen-haired maiden or a gallant young squire at the midsummer feast, and your heart does a thing it's never done before. There are no dating apps, no flirty emojis, no long stares over overpriced lattes, just the crushing reality that courtship in the Middle Ages requires 3 things: a quill, a scrap of parchment, and a working knowledge of Latin grammar, complicated enough to summon a minor pope. Welcome to the world of medieval love letters, where the language of romance was not, "Hey, I like your eyes," but more like, "O most resplendent beacon of celestial virtue. I am besieged by the arrows of Cupid, and seek thy merciful glance upon my afflicted soul." Yes, that's how people flirted. In Latin. Not just Latin, formal, flowery, unreasonably poetic Latin, with more metaphor than a Shakespearean sonnet on steroids. And the reason was simple: Latin was the language of the educated. And if you were going to impress your crush, you needed to sound like you'd just walked out of a monastery and into their heart. And if you couldn't write it yourself, you hired someone. That's right. Medieval Europe had professional love letter ghostwriters, basically romance consultants. You'd say, "I want to tell her she has nice elbows and that I'm emotionally available," and the writer would hand you back something like, "My soul aches in nocturnal solitude, yearning for the luminous grace of thy divine joints." That's not love. That's linguistics with an identity crisis. But people loved it, because in a society where love was often arranged forced or negotiated over livestock, writing about love felt radical daring and a little bit scandalous. It was private, it was personal, and it could be very dramatic. Some letters were dozens of lines long, comparing the beloved to stars, lilies, saints, and occasionally vegetables. One letter from a 12th century monk compared a woman's voice to honey, dripping from the comb, which is beautiful, until you realize he probably hadn't spoken to a woman in 10 years and might have just been hungry. And it wasn't always men writing. Noblewomen, nuns, and literary ladies got in on the action, too. Heloise of the famous Abelard and Heloise Duo wrote letters so emotionally intense, they make modern breakup texts look like shopping lists. She used phrases like, "I desired you more than salvation," which, while poetic, probably made her local priest break into a cold sweat. And then there were the troubadours. Oh, the troubadours. Medieval boy band energy meets philosophical angst. These were the guys who roamed from court to court singing love songs to noble women they were legally forbidden to touch while wearing tights and comparing freckles to starlight. They turned longing into a career. If you think modern musicians are dramatic, meet Bernard de Ventadour, who once declared that he would rather die in yearning than live in dull contentment. Dude, just send a fruit basket. But what really made these letters spicy wasn't just the language, it was the danger. Because let's not forget, many of these love letters were written in secret, behind a husband's back, between monasteries, across class boundaries. Passing a note could be as risky as passing a dagger. Couriers had to memorize letters in case they were intercepted. Nobles used ciphered Latin to hide intent. Some people disguised their love letters as religious poetry. O light. Divine actually meant, "Meet me behind the stables after vespers." Love was war, war with conjugations, and grammar was your armor. In fact, during the 13th century, schools in Paris started teaching young men how to write artful letters of affection. That's right, there were literal instruction manuals for medieval flirting. These taught everything from how to begin a letter, salutations from one who burns in devotion, to how to close it, yours in eternal longing and possibly sin. Imagine your teacher grading that. Nice use of subjunctive mood, Jeffrey. Very erotic. But not all letters were equal. A true romantic epistle followed certain conventions. You began with praise, extreme praise. The kind of praise that made it sound like the object of your affection had personally handcrafted the moon. Then you confessed your feelings ideally with enough metaphors to make a monk blush. Then came the suffering. Love in the Middle Ages was not supposed to be happy. It was supposed to be painful, noble, tragic. If your love letter didn't include at least one sentence about being consumed by the fire of passion or pierced by the arrow of fate, were you even trying? And finally, the ask. A reply, a meeting, a token, something, anything to show the letter hadn't gone directly into a fireplace. Because despite all the flowery prose, rejection was a constant possibility. And sometimes the only reply you got was cold silence or a returned note with Deus Vult, but I don't scribbled on it. But here's the strangest part. Despite being drenched in metaphor, these letters were deeply personal. They let people, especially women, express emotions society usually crushed under dowries and obedience. A Latin love letter was a tiny rebellion. It said, I see you, I want you. I read Cicero for this. And that meant something, even if it didn't work out, even if the relationship ended with a nunnery or a duel or both. It was real, romantic, and very, very grammatical. So the next time you send a text like, you up or I miss you, just remember your medieval counterpart probably wrote, I lie awake under the cruel yoke of solitude, tormented by dreams of your incomparable brow. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. Exhausting, but beautiful. Picture this. You're a 14th century peasant. You've survived the plague, the taxes, and your neighbor's suspicious goat that may or may not be a witch in disguise. But just when you think things are finally looking up, your child sneezes 3 times in a row, a chicken lays an egg shaped like a skull, and the wind shifts direction ominously during evening prayers. In modern times, we'd maybe call a doctor or check WebMD and convince ourselves we have 6 minutes left to live. But in the medieval world, you grab some herbs, tie them into a vaguely symbolic knot, mutter a Latin phrase you half remembered from a drunk friar, and hang the whole thing above your door like a spiritual fly swatter. Welcome to the botanical panic room of the Middle Ages, where plants weren't just food or medicine, they were your first line of defense against everything from demons to indigestion. Forget garlic for flavor. In medieval Europe, garlic was a weapon. Not against vampires, because let's be honest, no one was quite sure what vampires even were yet, but against evil spirits, bad dreams, witches, unexplainable rashes, and that feeling you get when a crow stares at you too long. And garlic was just the beginning. Mugwort protects travelers. Rosemary. Good for memory and scaring off malevolent entities. St. John's wort. Basically the medieval version of an antivirus software update. They didn't just grow these plants, they believed in them, they prayed over them, they blessed them with holy water. Some were even picked under strict celestial conditions. You must gather this root at midnight during the full moon while reciting Psalm 91 backward and avoiding eye contact with toads. Which raises the question, who had the time for this? Apparently everyone. Because in a world where science was basically alchemy plus wishful thinking, plants filled the gap between hope and helplessness. You had a bad harvest. Must be a hex rub basil on your forehead. Your baby won't stop crying. Evil eye burned fennel under the crib. Your cow looks slightly anxious, tie a garland of rue around its neck, and sing a hymn. Problem solved. Now let's talk about house protection. Today we install alarm systems. Back then people hung bunches of herbs over their doorways like aggressive Etsy projects. Dill was a popular choice. So was juniper, which also made your house smell vaguely like a desperate attempt at Christmas. The logic. If it smells weird, demons won't like it. Honestly, that tracks. There were even specific herbs for specific demons, as if the spiritual world had Yelp reviews and preferences. Beelzebub, 1 star, hates lavender loves corrupting monks. Speaking of monks, they were the original herbal influencers. Medieval monastic gardens were part vegetable patch, part apothecary, part exorcism supply closet. Monks wrote entire manuals about which plant to use for which spiritual ailment. They mixed theology with botany, like it was a smoothie of salvation. One 9th century text recommended a mix of sage ash leaves and the sign of the cross to banish impure thoughts and leg cramps. Multitasking at its finest. Then there's mandrake. Ah, mandrake, the diva of medieval plants. Shaped vaguely like a person rumored to scream when uprooted, and allegedly lethal if handled incorrectly. People thought it could cure everything from infertility to demonic possession. To harvest it safely, some believed you had to tie a dog to the root plug your ears and let the poor dog do the pulling while you hid behind a rock. Somewhere out there, a medieval dog union is still demanding justice. But the absurdity didn't stop at dogs and mandrakes. Entire rituals were built around plants. Some towns held spring festivals where villagers marched through fields waving fennel and chanting protective verses like "Out foul spirit. Into the ditch we cast thee with this lettuce." Okay, maybe not lettuce. But wouldn't that be something? The church, of course, had mixed feelings about all this. On one hand, they loved plants when saints used them. St. Hildegard of Bingen practically had a medieval lifestyle blog on herbal healing. But on the other hand, if a peasant woman used too many herbs too confidently, she risked being accused of witchcraft faster than you can say time infusion. The line between herbalist and heretic was razor thin and usually drawn by a bishop with a grudge. But fear not. If you were a respectable noble with a headache and access to a monastery garden, you could enjoy your herb poultices guilt-free. Some even wore sachets of herbs under their tunics, part perfume, part protection, part humble brag. What's that smell? Oh, just a blend of wormwood, clove, and divine intercession. The obsession went beyond individual households. Entire buildings were blessed with plants. Churches decorated with yew and ash to ward off storms. Castles planted rows of protective hedges not for beauty, but because someone once wrote that hawthorn bushes confused the devil. Honestly, I too would be confused if I had to cross a spiky bush just to haunt someone. Let's not forget love spells. Medieval flirts didn't rely on charm alone. They had herbs. A pinch of vervain under your pillow, a sprig of basil tucked in your belt, and boom, you're ready to fall in love or accidentally summon a minor demon. Either way, exciting weekend. But in truth, this wasn't just silliness. It was survival. Plants gave people a sense of agency in a world where they had little control. They couldn't explain diseases. They didn't understand mental illness. But they could grind up valerian and hope it soothed the soul. And when you're living in a thatched hut with rats' rain and rumors of werewolves, a bundle of dried sage might be the closest thing to peace of mind. Eventually, science showed up like an exasperated parent and sorted out what worked, what didn't, and what was just moldy moss pretending to be medicine. But even today, echoes remain. We still hang wreaths. We still burn incense. We still sip herbal teas to calm our nerves before Monday meetings. And if you've ever said, "I need some fresh air and eucalyptus to clear my energy," congratulations, you're continuing a 1,000-year-old tradition of fighting invisible forces with fragrant leaves. So the next time you roll your eyes at essential oils or side-eye a friend for smudging their apartment with sage, just remember your medieval ancestors would have absolutely blessed their chickens with rosemary and sprinkled lavender on their taxes. Plants weren't just plants. They were hope. They were protection. And sometimes they were the only thing standing between you and whatever spooky nonsense was lurking in the woods. In our world of selfies, Snapchat filters and front-facing cameras so powerful they can detect your soul's insecurities. The humble mirror seems, well, humble. But if you were strolling through a medieval monastery or castle and happened upon a mirror, you didn't just see your reflection. You saw a mystical object, a spiritual risk, a moral test, and if you were particularly unlucky, possibly the devil staring back at you while judging your haircut. Because in the Middle Ages, mirrors weren't tools. They were portals, sacred things, symbolic things, potentially dangerous things. Holding a mirror wasn't just vanity, it was a brush with eternity, a chance to see your inner self, or depending on who you asked, a fast track to eternal damnation via forehead acne. The mirror you see was considered both divine and diabolical, depending on the century, the region, and how many monks had recently written dramatic treatises about reflections being the spawn of moral decay. Why the fear? Well, start with rarity. Medieval mirrors weren't the crisp, silver-backed rectangles you get today at IKEA. They were polished metal discs, bronze, sometimes obsidian, later glass, but often distorted, cloudy, and vaguely insulting. You didn't look into them so much as squint at your warped doppelganger and wonder if you were melting or if the mirror was just having a bad day. Despite that, people believed these reflective surfaces showed more than just faces. They revealed truth. Truth about your soul, your sins, your alignment with the divine. If you gazed too long, especially with impure thoughts, you might not like what you saw, or worse, what looked back. Some theologians argued that vanity in front of a mirror was the first step toward pride, and pride was the gateway sin. You start checking your hair, next thing you know you're founding heretical cults and declaring yourself a minor saint. It's a slippery slope. Women, of course, bore the brunt of this spiritual paranoia. Female beauty plus a mirror equaled moral panic. Nuns were warned against mirror gazing as if it would trigger spontaneous excommunication. In some monastic texts, mirrors were described as gateways to temptation, instruments of seduction, or more simply sin plates, which honestly sounds like a medieval tapas menu. But don't worry, men didn't get off scot-free. Knights, too, were warned not to spend too much time polishing their helmets and then suspiciously admiring themselves in the reflection. Too much mirror time meant weakness, worldliness, and possibly poor swordsmanship. Yet, despite all this religious tension, mirrors kept showing up in art, in literature, even in churches. Yes, churches. Because mirrors weren't just about vanity, they were also about divine reflection. Early Christian philosophers saw the mirror as a metaphor. The soul is like a mirror, and through faith it reflects the glory of God. It was an early theology meets poetry crossover event starring St. Augustine, who once wrote that the heart, when pure, reflects God like a mirror reflects the sun. Beautiful. Also impossible to fact-check. Then came the allegories. In literature, mirrors symbolized knowledge, self-awareness, and occasionally doom. In one popular 13th century text called Speculum Stultorum, the mirror of fools, a talking donkey explores morality via metaphorical reflections. Yes, that's right. Medieval literature included sentient donkeys preaching against narcissism. Meanwhile, in noble courts, ladies carried handheld mirrors made of silver or polished tin, often engraved with prayers or little Latin phrases like, "Know thyself," or "You're not getting any younger," Gertrude. These objects were half spiritual, half status symbol, like a Chanel bag blessed by a bishop. But the true paranoia around mirrors came during times of crisis, plague, war, famine, or Tuesday. When things went wrong, people looked for reasons, and if someone had a shiny object they stared into more than once a day, well, that smelled suspicious. In some villages, mirrors were blamed for attracting demons, not in a summoning circle way, but more like the devil is narcissistic and will crash your vanity party. There were actual cases of mirrors being smashed during exorcisms, tossed into rivers, or buried under church altars just in case they retained sinful energy. Some even believed mirrors captured souls, especially if someone died in front of one. Hence, the tradition still practiced in parts of the world today of covering mirrors after a death. Not out of superstition, of course, but because you don't want Grandma's ghost doing a final vibe check on her appearance. And let's talk about magic. Because naturally, if something is mysterious, medieval people will eventually use it for dark arts. Scrying, the practice of gazing into a reflective surface to see visions, was popular among those with more time than sense. Mirror magic was part of courtly rumors and folk traditions, usually involving young women trying to see their future husbands. Step 1. Light a candle. Step 2. Look into a mirror alone. Step 3. Wait for a ghostly fiancé to appear, hopefully holding flowers and not a severed head. It was romance meets horror meets early rom-com energy. And if that wasn't enough, some doctors, real robe-wearing, Latin-spouting doctors, used mirrors to diagnose illnesses. They'd hold a small mirror near your mouth and analyze the condensation pattern like reading a latte's foam for signs of spiritual decay. You may have bile imbalance, or you've sinned against St. Apollonia. Either way, you're getting leeches. But despite all the suspicion and ritual, people couldn't stay away from mirrors. They were too compelling, too mystical, too human. Because even if you were terrified of what it might reveal, you still looked. Just a peek, just a glimpse. Because to see your face, to study your own eyes, was, especially in a world of chaos and darkness, a rare form of control. A reflection meant identity, and identity meant power. So what did medieval people really fear? Was it the mirror, or was it themselves? The mirror didn't judge, but people did. And so the object remained sacred, feared, worshipped, feared again, sacred again, a cycle of reflection inside and out. Today we pass mirrors casually. We use them for makeup selfies and silent existential crises in elevator lobbies. But behind that smooth glass is centuries of symbolism, of monks trembling at their own reflections, of noble women peeking between prayers, of old herbalists mumbling charms before polishing bronze. The mirror, once holy, once heretical, now reduced to a decor accessory with LED lights. But somewhere deep in our DNA, we still pause. We still look. We still wonder, is that really me, or just who I've convinced myself to be? In a time when people believed sneezing too hard might release demons and doctors recommended roasted hedgehog as a cure for stomach cramps, you might assume that medieval folks didn't have time for pet couture. And yet, against all odds and all fleas, noble families across Europe were outfitting their dogs, monkeys, and yes, even squirrels in tailor-made garments that could put your modern streetwear collection to shame. Forget fur coats. These were fur wearers wearing coats. And not just any coats, embroidered velvet-lined, sometimes jewel-studded masterpieces designed by artisans who probably charged more per garment than most peasants made in a year. Because nothing says, God has blessed my family line like a pug in a brocade doublet. Let's start with the absurdly pampered lapdog. These tiny shivering creatures bred to tremble theatrically on silk cushions were draped in garments so elaborate they would have made Joan of Arc reconsider her armor choices. Capes with miniature clasps, collars stitched with family crests. In some Italian courts, noble women paraded their dogs in matching outfits. That's right, matching outfits. Like medieval power couples, but one of you barks at shadows. Meanwhile, over in France, noble lapdogs were so adored they had their own pillows at court banquets. Some even got perfumes because apparently smelling like a wet rat was considered unbecoming at royal functions. And when winter came, these dogs were wrapped in custom cloaks trimmed in rabbit fur or ermine. That's right, your pet wore another animal's coat. Meta. But the real insanity began when nobles extended this fashion madness to non-canine pets. Exotic animals were all the rage, and no self-respecting baron wanted to show up to a royal function without a lemur in lace or a monkey in monk robes. There are actual paintings still preserved of monkeys dressed as court jesters, sipping wine from silver goblets while wearing tiny bells on their hats. Bells on their hats, and don't even get me started on cats. Now, cats in the medieval mindset were complicated. Sometimes seen as satanic, other times worshipped like semi-divine exterminators. But if you were a noble with enough confidence to flaunt a feline companion, you could commission a velvet tunic for your whiskered friend, and maybe a matching collar with semi-precious stones. Because nothing says, "Don't touch me," like a ruby-studded collar on a cat already trying to kill you. Monks weren't immune to this madness either. In certain monastic communities, cats served as mouse catchers and occasionally spiritual companions. One Irish monk even wrote a poem to his cat Pangur Ban, describing their shared life of study and hunting. Did Pangur wear clothes? There's no proof. But if any cat ever deserved a miniature robe with a tiny quill embroidered on it, it was that smug, scholarly beast. But you may ask, why? Why would people invest in custom garments for animals that licked their own butts and regularly knocked over priceless goblets? Status, dear listener. Status was the oxygen of medieval nobility. The higher your hat, the longer your shoes, the more gold you stapled to your furniture, the more worthy you were of God's favor. Or so they believed. And if your pet looked fabulous, then clearly your bloodline had divine endorsement. Plus, it gave nobles something to talk about at endless feasts between courses of boiled swan and almond paste. Ah, yes, Lady Eleanor, your greyhound's new tunic is exquisite. Is that Burgundian silk? No, Venetian. Oh, how provincial of me. The pet fashion trend even led to the creation of pet jewelry. Gold chains for greyhounds, miniature crowns for parrots. There was even an Austrian duchess who reportedly had matching lockets made for herself and her spaniel. Inside, a portrait of each other. That's right, 14th century pet owner selfies. Commissioned in oil, hung in parlors, but naturally with great fashion came great judgment. Clergy ever on the lookout for fresh sin condemned this trend as an indulgence of the prideful and a mockery of divine order, which is rich considering some bishops were riding around in palanquins carried by servants dressed as angels. Still, sermons were given, scrolls were written, and somewhere a monk wept quietly as a dachshund in chainmail pranced past the cathedral. Speaking of chainmail, yes, war dogs had armor. Not all pets were perfumed lap floofs. Some noble hounds went into battle. And while functional armor made sense, no one wants a naked dog in a war zone. Some lords went the extra mile and added decorative flourishes, crests on helmets, ornamental scrollwork on breastplates, even tassels. Because if your dog was going to bite someone on a battlefield, he might as well look fabulous doing it. These armored dogs weren't just muscle. They were message. They screamed, "My family line is so established, even my animal entourage gets forged steel." Meanwhile, peasants had cows, naked cows, occasionally goats. The most luxurious outfit a peasant animal got was a bell and maybe on a good year a blanket. The divide between noble pets and common beasts was as stark as between a Bentley and a bicycle with a wobbly wheel. But the most extravagant and honestly hilarious evidence of pet clothing comes from funerary records. In several noble households, pets were buried in their outfits. There are actual records of dogs interred with prayer beads, cats wrapped in silks, even parrots in embroidered shrouds. Some of these tombs were marked, others were incorporated into family crypts. In one French case, a duke's favorite spaniel was buried with a gold-stitched pillow and a velvet coat bearing the family crest. The inscription simply read, "He was loyal, he was loved, he looked stunning." If that's not goals, I don't know what is. And let's not forget the artisans, the unsung heroes of this trend. Somewhere in medieval Europe, tailors were hunching over candlelight, measuring ferrets for cloaks, arguing about whether a falcon's hat should have feathers or just imply feathers. These were people who, despite the plague and papal inquisitions, chose to dedicate their lives to dressing animals in formal wear. That's commitment. So, next time you see a modern dog in a raincoat, a cat in a lion mane wig, or a hamster in a top hat, know this: they're part of a proud, ridiculous tradition stretching back centuries. A tradition born not just of love for animals, but of the eternal human impulse to project our identity status and questionable taste onto everything we touch, including the creature chewing on our shoes. In the grand tapestry of medieval absurdity, pet fashion stands as both comic relief and a weirdly sincere expression of affection. Because, yes, maybe that greyhound didn't need a velvet doublet, but someone looked at that dog and thought, "You deserve to shine." And in a world full of mud war and soup that looked suspiciously like yesterday's bathwater, that small act of joy that was sacred. There are birthday parties, there are weddings, there are family reunions that feel like medieval torture. And then there are medieval feasts, week-long marathon festivals of food, booze, music, dancing, and wildly inappropriate jousting that somehow combined religious overtones with moral chaos. If you've ever been to a modern wedding and thought, This is dragging on. Just be grateful you weren't a 14th century squire expected to dance for 6 days straight in chainmail leggings while pretending to enjoy boiled peacock. In the Middle Ages, a noble party wasn't merely a celebration. It was a declaration, a flex, a royal TED Talk on how absurdly wealthy, powerful, and spectacularly indulgent you were. Kings threw feasts to demonstrate divine favor. Dukes did it to prove loyalty. Barons did it because the ale shipment had just arrived and the goat hadn't exploded this year. The more food, the more noise, the more musicians, jesters, dogs on stilts, jugglers with questionable dexterity, and wine-induced arguments between priests and poets, the better. We're talking 7 full days of madness. Let's paint the scene. Day 1 guests arrive, led in by trumpeters who haven't bathed since Pentecost and are greeted with wine so strong it could dissolve moral boundaries. By hour 3, someone's already singing Gregorian chants ironically, and the pigs roasted whole apple in mouth are being carved with knives that also doubled as conflict resolution tools later in the evening. Then come the courses. Not 1, not 2. We're talking 15. Boiled fish roast, swan eels stuffed with almonds, and desserts that looked like miniature castles. There was a dish literally called cockentrice, which was half pig, half bird sewn together, roasted, and presented as a mythical beast, because medieval chefs apparently confused cuisine with necromancy. Of course, the drinking began immediately and never really stopped. Mead ale spiced wine, more ale, and then something called hippocras, a medieval cocktail of wine and sugar that sounds like it could also strip paint. The point wasn't moderation. The point was survival. Those who remained upright by sundown were invited to the dancing hall, where the term dancing covered everything from elegant court waltzes to drunk knights trying to somersault in armor. Day 2. More food, more dancing, and now the tournament begins. Because nothing says, let's celebrate love like smashing your friend off a horse with a sharpened pole. Jousts, melees, and contests of strength dominate the day, often accompanied by awkward poetry contests in the corner where some poor bard is reciting rhymes about turnips, while everyone else is screaming at the falconer to release the birds already. There were also surprise theatricals, often performed by traveling actors or bored monks in disguise. Yes, monks, who, after a few goblets of spiced wine, were more than happy to impersonate saints while balancing pies on their heads. Day 3. The hangovers begin, but so does the pilgrimage. Because obviously after 2 days of chaos, it's time for a religious procession. Everyone still half drunk is led to a chapel where they pray for forgiveness, mostly for whatever happened between the jester and the duchess in the stables. A priest offers a sermon. No one listens. The minstrels play a sad tune. Everyone weeps, not from piety, but because someone just stepped on a chicken. Day 4 games, archery, knife throwing, sheep wrestling, pig chasing, and a bizarre tradition called courtly riddling, where nobles tried to outwit each other with complex riddles, most of which revolved around riddles about saints, mud, or someone's missing trousers. Bets were made, fortunes were lost. One duke bet an entire vineyard on whether his pet goose could juggle. It couldn't. Day 5, more food. More wine, more guests arriving even though the party is already well underway. At this point, someone builds a human pyramid using servants, a minstrel accidentally sets fire to a tapestry with his lute, and a horse wanders into the feasting hall wearing a crown. No one knows why. No one questions it. Day 6, the symbolic reenactments begin. Noble families stage fake battles representing historical events that no one understands complete, with toy catapults dramatically shouted Latin phrases, and one noblewoman fainting on command every hour. This is also when bards are judged in competitions that determine who can cry most poetically while singing about the moon. The loser is thrown into a fountain. Day 7, the closing ceremony. Guests hungover and half-mad gather in the great hall for the night of reflection. Candles are lit. Everyone pretends to be sober. The host gives a speech about the sanctity of community while someone vomits into a chalice behind a curtain. It ends with a solemn vow to do this again next year, followed by one last round of drinking. So intense it's technically considered a siege on the liver, and then like that, it's over. Guests limp away, the servants cry, the kitchen is on fire, the horses are missing, and the minstrels are asleep in the wine barrels. But the stories. The stories live on. Stories of the knight who danced with a roast duck, the bishop who confessed to stealing a pie mid-procession, the juggler who became a noble by accident. Modern weddings last a few hours, maybe a weekend. But these were operas of chaos, catwalks of culinary bravado, spiritual marathons of indulgence and accidental piety. All for what? To show off, to impress, to forget just for a week that outside the walls was a world of plague mud and peasant uprisings. These were medieval music festivals without the wristbands. They were Renaissance fairs before the Renaissance. And perhaps, most absurdly, they were moments when the elite believed they could touch eternity by feeding everyone until they exploded. Because in the end, no matter the century, no matter the crown, people have always loved a good party, especially one that ends with someone jousting a tree while wearing a codpiece shaped like a goose. In an age where most people couldn't read, write, or even sign their own name without turning it into some kind of Rorschach test, medieval churches faced a peculiar problem. How do you explain the divine complexities of the Holy Scripture to a crowd whose average literacy level hovers somewhere between goat and village rock? The answer obviously was to turn the cathedral into a divine comic book made of sunlight and colored glass. Behold, stained glass, God's preferred PowerPoint presentation, delivered directly to the eyeballs of every dirt-covered peasant, drooling shepherd, or overly dramatic bishop who wandered through those oversized, echoey stone sanctuaries. Now, these weren't your ordinary windows. These were 40-foot-high explosions of color depicting saints getting martyred devils, doing the Macarena angels playing medieval violins that looked suspiciously like ladles, and biblical scenes so outlandish they could double as deleted scenes from an apocalyptic soap opera. And they told stories, stories designed to educate, inspire, terrify, and remind you that yes, God is always watching even when you think you're alone in the barn with your neighbor's chickens. Let's start with the basics. The average medieval villager had no access to books. Why? Because books were rare, hand-copied, and chained to library walls like they were dangerous magical artifacts, which in the eyes of the local clergy, they kind of were. Add in the fact that most people were illiterate, and suddenly you have to explain the entire book of Genesis using visuals, which is why medieval stained glass often looked like a Renaissance fever dream. You'd walk into church, lift your soot-covered face, and bam, there's Adam being formed from dirt, Eve pulling an apple, like it's the last donut at a feast, and a snake with disturbingly human arms offering forbidden fruit, like it's a promotional free sample. It was biblical education through optics, literally. Every window was a silent sermon, every panel a mini morality play. If the bishop forgot his notes, no problem. Just point to the window behind him and shout, "And lo, the Lord smote the sinners, see," right there next to St. Dismas juggling fire. The stories weren't subtle. You had Cain killing Abel in full, dramatic flare, blood anguish, questionable anatomy. You had Noah building the ark while animals filed in like guests at a wedding reception, and the whole flood scene usually looked like someone spilled a bottle of blue wine across the entire window. And yes, the Tower of Babel looked more like a medieval brewery than a skyscraper, but who's counting? More importantly, the messages were painfully obvious. Lust, bad. Cue a window with naked sinners being chased by demons who all have suspiciously good hair. Pride. Worse, here's a king tumbling off his golden throne while angels shrug in the background. Humility. Excellent. Observe a barefoot monk being blessed by a levitating pigeon. No need for nuance. Just vibes. These windows weren't just religious. They were social media before the printing press. People gathered beneath them, stared up, whispered to one another. Did you see what St. Margaret did to that dragon? Absolute legend. And just like TikTok trends, certain scenes were reused, remixed, repeated. The crucifixion. It's everywhere. The Annunciation. At least 5 versions per cathedral. The Last Supper. Basically the medieval equivalent of Gangnam Style, omnipresent, dramatic, and copied badly by other artists trying to be relevant. But let's not pretend it was all high-minded theology. Some windows were outright bizarre. There's a famous French panel showing a nun pulling a demon out of a man's mouth with tongs. Another features a unicorn stabbing a lion. One German cathedral depicts Judas being boiled in a pot of green goo by a devil in a chef's hat. At a certain point, you start wondering whether these were meant to teach theology or just give kids nightmares so they'd behave in Sunday school. And speaking of kids, these windows were basically their only form of education. If you were 6 years old, bored during Mass, and staring at a window of the Last Judgment where souls are being dragged into hell by red-skinned goblins while angels weigh hearts on a scale. Like it's a heavenly farmer's market, you learned real quick that lying about stealing bread might not be worth eternal damnation in a boiling cauldron. And that was the point. The windows were moral instruction via fear-wonder and a whole lot of leaded glass. They were designed not just to tell stories, but to make those stories stick. You didn't just hear the tale of Jonah and the whale. You saw him mid-swallow legs, flailing eyes wide right there in Technicolor. You didn't need to know Latin. You didn't need to read a scroll. You just needed to look up and be scared straight by glass-based storytelling. But beyond their function, stained glass also served one important medieval purpose, showing off. If you were a wealthy donor, say Sir Godfrey of Overcompensation, you could pay for a window featuring St. George slaying the dragon, and sneakily insert your own face as one of the onlookers, preferably the one holding a goblet and looking impressed. It was religious devotion and self-promotion, like sponsoring a church pew that says, "Reserved for Sir Chad." Some nobles even had their entire family trees etched in stained glass alongside apostles and angels, because nothing screams piety like equating your cousin Rupert with St. Peter. The windows were also technological marvels. Creating them wasn't easy. Glass had to be melted, colored with metal oxides, and then painted with details using powdered iron. Artisans spent years crafting single panels. They used iron rods, wood frames, and occasionally cursing loud enough to make nearby monks blush. And when they finally installed the window, they prayed it wouldn't collapse the wall. In a world where most things were brown, gray, or dirt-colored, stained glass windows were explosions of magic. Sunlight filtered through sapphire blues, ruby reds, emerald greens, turning the cathedral floor into a celestial disco ball of holy radiation. Worshippers stepped into light that looked divine, and for many it was divine. It was their first glimpse of beauty, of color, of what they imagined heaven might look like. These windows weren't just glass, they were gateways to God, to meaning, to medieval Instagram. Every panel was a story, every story a lesson, every lesson a sermon, without words, without books, without TikTok dances, just light color and a level of theatrical storytelling that even Netflix would envy. And yes, maybe some of it was over the top. Maybe the angels had too many wings. Maybe the devils had suspiciously human mustaches. Maybe someone in the workshop got lazy and reused a sheep's face for the Virgin Mary. But it worked. It captured the imagination of a world starved for light color and clarity. So next time you walk into an old cathedral, squint up at a stained glass window and think, "Wow, that's beautiful. Remember this." You're looking at the medieval equivalent of a viral thread. A 600-year-old story frozen in color, whispering, "Let me show you something you'll never forget." Once upon a time, long before Spotify playlists promised to align your chakras, before YouTube ads claimed binaural beats could unlock your brain's secret genius, and before meditation apps made you feel guilty for not sleeping to whale noises, people believed that music could literally cure diseases. Not just soothe the soul, we're talking full-on, your legs falling off. Try a harp kind of healing. Welcome to the medieval world where the lute was basically the MRI machine of divine medicine. Monks hummed away your sins, and a well-timed Gregorian chant was the only prescription your doctor monk would give you, besides maybe stop sinning so much. Now let's set the mood. Picture a medieval hospital, not a sterile white hall with beeping monitors and grumpy nurses, but more like a dimly lit monastery filled with the scent of herbs, unwashed feet, and overwhelming faith. Your physician is probably also a priest, your bed is made of straw, and your chart is a wax tablet that just says sick. In this environment, music wasn't entertainment. It was sacred, powerful, mysterious. And according to the leading thinkers of the time, many of whom hadn't actually seen a patient since the last crusade, it was medicine. Let's start with the theory. The ancient Greeks, particularly Pythagoras, yes, the triangle guy, believed that the universe was made of harmonious vibrations. Everything stars bodies' bowel movements was music. The medieval church heard this and said, "Great, let's cure gout with a flute solo." They developed something called the doctrine of affections, which suggested that music could manipulate the body's humors. You remember those blood phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, because nothing screams science like treating anxiety with leeches and a lute. So if your humors were out of whack, and let's be honest, in the Middle Ages they were always out of whack, music could help. Sad. Listen to a cheerful melody in D major, angry Gregorian chants in a minor key, possessed by demons. Obviously the organ. There were literal playlists for everything. Monasteries even kept musical prescriptions. Feeling melancholic, they'd say. Ah yes, Brother Benedict's Ode to St. Ethelred's Toenail works every time. And the instruments, oh the instruments. Lutes with more strings than sense, harps that looked like furniture, Rebec's shawms, hurdy-gurdies, each one with a sound range somewhere between dying cat and bard being strangled. But in the right hands, these instruments were divine tools, healing spells, sonic syringes. A single well-timed melody could calm a fever, soothe a broken heart, or at least distract you long enough to not notice your leg was being amputated with a hot spoon. And then there were the monks. Ah, yes, the Gregorian chanters, hooded men who shuffled into candlelit chambers, hummed syllables in Latin, and genuinely believed that their chants could echo through your soul and realign your internal plumbing. Chanting wasn't just singing, it was spiritual surgery. The vibrations of the voice were thought to enter your ears, dance around your corrupted insides, and realign your sinful organs. And the effect, honestly, people felt better. Partly because music is calming, partly because placebo is real, but mostly because when you're living in a world of plague, famine, and surprise, Viking raids, a monk humming Dominus Vobiscum at your bedside, is the medieval equivalent of a spa day. Nobles took it even further. Some lords kept entire choirs on retainer, walking, talking medical teams who would perform madrigals to treat anything from migraines to marital problems. If you were a particularly moody duke, you might demand a nightly lute recital to keep your spirits balanced, your dreams holy, and your digestion functioning. And yes, there are records of lords believing that if you played the wrong note in the wrong key near a sick person, it could make them worse. So naturally, musicians were terrified. Play the wrong scale, they feared, and Sir Geoffrey might burst into boils. Hospitals, too, embraced the music cure, especially the religious ones, which was basically all of them. You'd find sickbeds arranged around choirs, with patients propped up like audience members at a particularly solemn concert. Was the music good? Debatable. But it was better than the alternative, which usually involved bleeding prayer or swallowing something ground up from a deer's bladder. But here's where it gets wild. Not only did people think music could heal, they thought it could protect against sin, disease, and temptation. That's right. Music wasn't just Tylenol, it was moral armor. Want to keep demons out. Blast the organ. Want to prevent lustful thoughts. Play a psalm. One popular belief held that the devil hated harmony, so by filling the air with sweet sounds, you could literally drive Satan away like a raccoon confronted by a vacuum cleaner. There were even traveling musical healers, sort of a medieval mix between a bard and a wellness guru, who wandered from town to town offering musical blessings. Feeling cursed, they'd say, try my new 12-minute lute meditation, cures boils and existential dread. The irony, of course, is that many of these musicians had no training terrible instruments and a tendency to make everything worse. But, again, placebo and faith. lots and lots of faith. And here's the best part. The church encouraged it, not because they had scientific proof, not because it worked, but because music was orderly, structured, godly. And anything that made the population more calm, more obedient, and less likely to riot over the price of turnips was worth promoting. Music was divine order, and divine order was preferable to chaos, even if that order came in the form of a nun banging two spoons together while humming in Latin. Did it work? Sometimes. Maybe. Probably not. But in a world of filth, fear, and flagellation, the idea that a melody could mend you was a source of hope, and that was half the battle. So, next time you're listening to lo-fi beats to study, or binaural tones to fall asleep, or rain sounds to stop panicking about rent, just remember you're participating in a long, weird, sacred tradition. One where people once believed that a single well-played chord could balance your soul, banish your demons, and fix your kidneys. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't entirely wrong. After all, in a century where doctors prescribed crushed emeralds and pigeon blood, a lute solo was probably your best option. Maps are supposed to help you find your way. Turn left at the river. Cross the old forest, avoid the suspicious marsh with the glowing fog, that kind of thing. But in the Middle Ages, maps weren't so much tools for navigation as they were chaotic art projects with a side of theological paranoia. You weren't just charting coastlines, you were mapping out divine judgment, ancient gossip, and enough sea monsters to populate a low-budget fantasy novel. And yes, let's talk about those sea monsters. Because nothing screams, this is a factual geographic document, quite like drawing a kraken, eating a boat the size of a dinner plate while a naked mermaid waves from the next corner. Welcome to the wild world of medieval cartography, where if you didn't know what was out there, you just drew a dragon and called it a day. Now, before we laugh too hard, let's remember the context. Most medieval mapmakers had never left their village, let alone seen the sea, a camel, or a coastline that wasn't completely imaginary. They relied on second-hand tales, monk-approved manuscripts, and the occasional fever dream from some guy who swore he sailed west and saw men with dog heads. And if you're sitting in a cold abbey with limited information and zero access to satellite imagery, what do you do when you get to the edge of what you know easy? You write, "Here be dragons," and let future explorers sort it out. Let's be clear, not all medieval maps were useless. Some, like the Portolan charts, were surprisingly accurate for coastal navigation. But the most famous ones, the big circular church-sponsored wonders like the Hereford Mappa Mundi, were more concerned with showing you where heaven was than how to get to your aunt's village. These maps weren't designed to get you from point A to point B. They were cosmic diagrams, allegorical infographics, a medieval PowerPoint presentation with slide transitions made of theological dread. Jerusalem was at the center. The Garden of Eden was somewhere in Asia, protected by flaming swords, and the unknown parts of the world. That's where the fun began. Enter the monsters. You had dragons curled around the corners of the earth, griffins lurking in the mountains of India, giant scaly serpents swimming in the Arctic Sea, and islands filled with one-legged men who used their foot as umbrellas. No, really. They were called cyopods, and they were the medieval equivalent of, look, I don't know what's there, but it's probably weird. These weren't just doodles. They were warnings. A way of saying, don't go here, Jeff. You will be eaten cursed or worse, converted by heathens. And while some monsters were borrowed from ancient myths, others were straight-up medieval originals. Take the Blemii people with no heads whose faces were in their chests. Or the Panati men with ears so big they used them as blankets. These weren't biology errors, they were geography placeholders. Something lives there, the cartographer said, and it probably looks like a Picasso sketch with anxiety. And why dragons specifically? Because dragons were perfect symbols for the unknown. They were huge, terrifying, supernatural, and just vague enough that nobody could fact-check you. Didn't know what lived in the Black Sea dragon. Not sure what's beyond the Sahara dragon. Heard a sailor scream before vanishing off the coast of Ireland. Definitely dragon. It was lazy, yes, but also deeply efficient. And let's not ignore the religious element. For many monks and mapmakers, the unknown world was spiritually dangerous. Pagan lands, demon realms, places outside the Christian worldview. Dragons weren't just beasts, they were symbols of chaos, heresy, and all the things God had yet to conquer. In a way, putting dragons on the map was medieval cartography's version of Here There Be vibes, and they're demonic. And then there's the sheer artistic flair. Some of these dragons were beautifully drawn, coiling through oceans, biting ships in half-breathing stylized flames into the wind. Others looked like a 6-year-old tried to draw a crocodile from memory. But either way, they added drama. Maps weren't boring scrolls of data. They were visual epics, each inch filled with danger mystery and the artistic equivalent of a shrug. Don't ask me what's here, the map said. Ask the guy who got eaten. And yet these dragons weren't entirely fiction. They reflected genuine fear. The world was big, unknown, and deadly. Travel was rare. Borders were blurry. If you survived a sea voyage, you came back either a saint, a liar, or a lunatic. And sometimes you returned with stories of giant beasts, men with horns islands that screamed, or cities made of gold, guarded by flame. The cartographer didn't know if it was true, but it made the map more interesting. Of course, not everyone believed in literal dragons. Many scholars saw them as metaphors, warnings of moral danger, symbols of pride, greed, or temptation. But to the average peasant staring at a wall-sized map in the town hall, the message was clear: stay home, eat your bread, don't sail east. So what happened to the dragons? Over time, as exploration expanded, dragons retreated. The unknown became known. The blank corners of the map filled in with ports, trade routes, and less exciting things like tax zones. And as the Enlightenment arrived, the dragons disappeared, banished not by knights but by cartographers with rulers and better data. But deep down, don't we miss them? There's something romantic about a map with monsters, something honest. It admitted what we didn't know. It said, this part. It's scary. Proceed with caution, or maybe just don't. Modern maps are precise, useful, boring. They don't warn you about existential dread or mysterious islands full of cannibals. They just tell you the speed limit. But medieval maps, they were adventure on parchment, faith on vellum, fear in ink, a swirling, fire-breathing reminder that the world was vast, terrifying, and full of wonders beyond your village's mud fence. So the next time your GPS glitches and you feel lost, just imagine a dragon watching from the corner of your map. Not to eat you, just to remind you that getting lost is how legends begin. In the Middle Ages, faith was serious business. So serious, in fact, that entire cities, economies, and wars were shaped around toenails. Not just any toenails, holy toenails. And yes, if you're imagining a church proudly displaying a splinter they claimed came from the true cross, you're not far off. But it gets better. Or worse, depending on how you feel about kissing bones that may or may not belong to someone named St. John-ish. Because in medieval Europe, relics weren't just spiritual symbols. They were power, proof, profit. They were the original collectibles. Pokemon cards for the pious. So let's dive headfirst, not feet first, into the bizarre and often hilariously misguided obsession with holy relics. First things first, what's a relic? Simple. A relic is a physical object associated with a saint or a holy event. This could be anything from a finger bone to a piece of cloth that touched a sacred elbow. The Church, being the grand bureaucratic machine that it was, even categorized them. First-class relics, body parts of saints, hair, teeth, skulls. You name it, someone was venerating it. Second-class relics. Things saints wore or touched. A shoe, a belt, a medieval sock probably unwashed since the martyrdom. Third-class relics. Basically merch, anything that touched a first or second-class relic, which technically made everything a relic if you were determined enough and had enough holy rubbing cloth. And boy, were people determined. By the 12th century, the relic trade was booming harder than the local tavern on St. Crispin's feast day. Every respectable cathedral had its own relics, which they would parade through the streets like divine celebrities. Come one, come all, and see the thumb of St. Bartholomew. It's slightly mummified and might smell weird, but it can totally cure gout. And people came. By the wagon load. Pilgrimages sprang up not just for spiritual enlightenment, but for a chance to touch a femur that may or may not have once belonged to someone vaguely Christian. Entire towns became holy hotspots based on how many bones they could fit in a gilded box. This wasn't just piety, it was marketing. Cathedrals fought tooth and nail, sometimes literally over teeth to acquire or discover relics. And by discover, I mean someone found a shin bone in a field and declared it holy based on vibes alone. The provenance unclear. The documentation non-existent. The belief absolute. But here's the kicker. Duplication wasn't a problem. There were at one point over 40 complete corpses of St. James floating around Europe. 40. Either he was the world's most generous saint, or the church had a copy-paste problem. Theologians tried to explain it away using the mystical logic of, well, miracles, duh, while skeptics just squinted and whispered, that's definitely a horse bone. But miracles sold, and miracles needed relics. So if your town was struggling economically, just find a piece of the true cross, say it glows on rainy Tuesdays, and watch the pilgrims roll in like tourists at a theme park with better incense. And don't even get me started on the weirder relics. There were vials of the Virgin Mary's milk feathers, from the Archangel Gabriel's wings, St. Peter's beard clippings, and perhaps the most legendary of all, the holy foreskin. Yes, that was a thing. And not just once multiple foreskins claimed to be the one true snip. It became a theological headache if Jesus only had one body. How were there 3 of his baby bits being venerated across Europe? One French town even claimed their relic levitated on Christmas Eve while singing. The Vatican predictably tried to quietly phase out such relics once things got a little too fleshy. But the damage was done. And let's talk security. These weren't left in dusty corners. Relics were enshrined in elaborate reliquaries, golden, jewel-encrusted containers, often shaped like the body part inside. A skull in a gold head, a finger in a jeweled hand. It was fashion meets morbidity meets medieval flexing. And theft. Oh, relic theft was a thing, a glorious, ridiculous thing. Monks sneaking into rival monasteries under the cover of night to liberate a saint's kneecap. Cities launching raids not for gold, but for a piece of rib. The act even had a name, pious theft, because apparently stealing was fine if you were doing it for God. Some even claimed the saints wanted to be stolen, leaving signs or making the relics glow to signal discontent with their current resting place. Please relocate me, the tibia allegedly whispered. The ventilation here is dreadful. And the pilgrims, oh the pilgrims. They walked hundreds of miles across disease-ridden roads and bandit-infested forests just to kneel before a scrap of cloth that touched a saint's cousin's cloak. And when they arrived, blessings, indulgences, and the warm, if slightly bone-scented, embrace of faith. It gave meaning, it gave hope, and it gave the local tavern something to overcharge for. But behind the veneration was something very human. People wanted proximity to the divine. In a world full of plague, famine, war, and deeply suspicious meat pies, a tiny bone in a golden box was a lifeline, a connection to something eternal, something that couldn't be burned, taxed, or stolen unless you were really sneaky and had a good cart. Modern historians love to mock it, but in many ways, relics were the original fan clubs. You picked your favorite saint, traveled to see their stuff, maybe bought a souvenir badge, and left feeling spiritually recharged. It was Comic-Con, but for martyrs. And just like fandoms today, it got weird. People fought over canon, argued about authenticity, traded relics like baseball cards. I'll swap you 2 vertebrae of St. Agnes for a certified molar of St. Thomas. No deal. That molar looks fake. Today, many of these relics still exist, some venerated, some locked in museum drawers, some lost to time. The church has since tightened its rules, and now you can't just declare your grandma's ring a holy object unless it's been verified. But in those wild medieval days, belief reigned supreme. Faith over fact, wonder over logic. And if you ever feel like modern society is irrational, Just remember, once upon a time, entire cities fought over who got to keep a saint's left kneecap. Let's be honest, when you picture a medieval castle, your mind probably conjures up something cold, damp, and about as cozy as a refrigerator filled with stone. And you wouldn't be wrong. Castles weren't exactly five-star resorts, they were fortresses. Their primary job was not to make you feel comfortable, but to keep angry neighbors with swords out. But believe it or not, in between dodging arrows and worrying about plague, medieval people did actually care about staying cool. And before you scoff and say, well, they just sweated it out in wool tunics, think again. Medieval engineers. Yes, engineers came up with some rather clever ways to beat the heat. Welcome to the wonderfully strange world of medieval air conditioning, brought to you by stone gravity and whatever breeze the Lord saw fit to send. First, let's talk about the architectural MVP of medieval climate control, thick stone walls. These bad boys weren't just good for stopping battering rams, they were excellent at regulating temperature. During the blazing summer months, the outer layers of the wall would absorb heat slowly, while the inner layers stayed cool, like the medieval version of a thermal flask. So while the peasants outside were roasting in their cabbage fields, the lords inside could retreat to their stone-clad halls and enjoy what can only be described as dungeon chic freshness. Of course, it helped if you were rich. Surprise. Climate comfort in the Middle Ages, like everything else, was a luxury. Lords and barons had castles with passive temperature control. Peasants had, well, roofs, sometimes. But back to castles. One of the more ingenious tricks was something we might call wind architecture. Castles were often built on elevated hills or near rivers, not just for military advantage, but for catching breezes. This wasn't just an aesthetic decision, it was strategic airflow. By placing openings and corridors in certain ways, medieval architects created natural air tunnels. Hot air would rise and escape through high windows or roof vents, while cooler air would drift in from shaded lower areas. Congratulations, you've just invented the thermal chimney effect, a concept modern engineers still use, except without the part where a pigeon might randomly drop in. And let's not forget about arrow slits, those narrow vertical slivers in castle walls. While primarily designed to shoot enemies in the face with style, they also served a second, less violent function: ventilation. Narrow on the outside, wider on the inside, these slits created a funnel effect that let in air while keeping out unwanted visitors. It's medieval crossbreeze, armed and breezy. Some castles also employed a genius form of basement cooling. The lower chambers, often used to store food and wine, were naturally cooler because they were underground. And because cold air sinks, thank you, basic physics, these spaces stayed consistently chill year-round. So when summer rolled around, nobles didn't just lounge in the Great Hall, they hosted parties in the cellar. Picture a medieval rave among barrels of salted meat. Smells questionable, but at least it's not 40 degrees. Then there's the creative use of courtyards and gardens. Many castles and manors featured central courtyards filled with greenery, water fountains, and shaded walkways. Not just for show, these elements helped cool the surrounding air. Evaporation from fountains provided a localized cooling effect. Shade from vines and trellises reduced ambient heat. In other words, medieval people were basically doing climate-responsive design centuries before air conditioning units started humming in every window. Let's also appreciate the ingenious use of clothing. It might seem counterintuitive, but all those layers of wool and linen weren't just for modesty or fashion. The layers actually helped insulate body temperature. In the summer, light-colored outer layers reflected sunlight, while linen undergarments absorbed sweat and kept skin cool. It was like walking around in your own personal swamp cooler minus the fan and ice. Oh, and fans. Yes, they existed. Not the electric kind, of course, but hand fans woven from reeds or feathers. These were particularly popular among the upper class, who didn't mind having a servant stand beside them all afternoon, waving palm leaves like they were Cleopatra with a tax problem. In royal courts, fan waving was practically an art form. There's even evidence of early mechanical fan contraptions, giant suspended cloths called punkas pulled back and forth by ropes operated by, you guessed it, some poor servant whose job description included air mover and occasional breeze deity. But by far the most impressive feat of medieval climate engineering belonged to, you won't believe this, the Moors in Spain. The Islamic palaces of Al-Andalus, especially the Alhambra, were architectural masterclasses in staying cool. They used masonry fountains, marble floors, wined towers, and geometrically arranged water channels to create an internal climate so refreshing that stepping inside was like entering a lemon-scented cloud. These techniques included something called a qanat, an underground aqueduct system that brought water from distant mountains to urban areas. The water was cooled naturally underground, then circulated through courtyards and basins. It didn't just keep the palace cool, it made the air fragrant, humidified, and utterly pleasant. Basically, it was the medieval equivalent of walking into a luxury spa and realizing someone thought about your comfort centuries before you were born. But let's not give everyone a free pass. Some castles were indeed sweatboxes. Ventilation depended entirely on how clever the architect was or how tight the budget ran. And while some barons enjoyed natural breezes, others probably sat in stuffy halls, wishing someone would invent a magic cooling box. Enter ice, rare, expensive, and wildly impractical. Some noble households stored snow and ice in ice pits deep holes in the ground insulated with straw or sawdust. These ice stores would last into the summer, giving the lucky few a brief taste of refrigerated luxury. Did it help cool rooms? Not really. But did it make you feel fancy to hold a cold goblet while your peasants sweat nearby? Absolutely. And that's what medieval innovation was all about, surviving with style. So while modern air conditioning relies on compressors, refrigerants, and the soothing hum of machines, the Middle Ages handled the heat with thick walls, clever airflow, and a touch of divine patience. It wasn't perfect. There were still heat waves. There were still sweaty tunics. But for a time when people also believed diseases came from bad smells, this level of environmental design was practically wizardry. And the next time your AC breaks down and you find yourself sweating through your shirt while cursing modern technology, remember, you could be living in a stone tower waving a feather fan and praying for a breeze while staring out an arrow slit. But hey, at least the wine in the basement would be cool. You're a kid in a medieval village somewhere between the local pigsty and the suspiciously bubbling well. Your daily schedule consists of herding geese avoiding rats the size of corgis and watching your neighbor's donkey eat its own cart. Life is simple. Life is earthy. Life is, how shall we say, educationally barren. Until one day a stranger rides into town. He wears a robe that smells like parchment, and regret carries a bag of books heavier than your village priest's judgment, and speaks Latin like it's a party trick. Congratulations, child. You now have a teacher, whether you like it or not. Meet the medieval traveling educator, also known as the itinerant teacher, also known as the guy who may or may not have been kicked out of a monastery for correcting someone's grammar too aggressively. These roving scholars were the unsung heroes of medieval literacy, the wandering Wi-Fi hotspots of their time. Armed with nothing but their brains, some questionable credentials, and an unhealthy obsession with Aristotle, they ventured from town to town, spreading the good word, spelling. Now, education in the Middle Ages was a patchwork quilt held together with sheep intestines and ambition. The church controlled most formal learning. Monasteries were the Ivy Leagues of the era. If your idea of Ivy League includes silent meals, bad lighting, and copying the same Bible verse until your hand cramps. But outside the cloistered world of monks, most kids, especially in rural areas, were stuck in the grand curriculum of don't die before harvest. That's where traveling teachers came in. They filled the educational void like caffeine fills a medieval mead hangover. They weren't glamorous. They weren't rich. They were basically medieval substitute teachers with a side hustle in existential philosophy. And yes, they walked miles through mud, past plague zones, often with only a few silver coins jingling in their pockets and an overwhelming desire to teach anyone, how to conjugate Latin verbs. These teachers weren't part of any official school system because, spoiler alert, there wasn't one. The idea of public schooling wouldn't appear for centuries. Instead, these scholars offered what we'd now call pop-up learning. They'd arrive in a village, declare themselves a magister, and hope someone in town had both children and the ability to pay with something other than chickens. Sometimes they taught in church porches, sometimes in barns, sometimes in the middle of a field next to a confused goat. The point was, learning happened wherever the teacher stopped walking. And what did they teach the trivium? No, not the metal band, the medieval version. Grammar, rhetoric, and logic, because nothing says childhood joy like learning Latin syntax before breakfast. If the students were lucky or unfortunate, depending on perspective, they'd get to tackle the quadrivium too: arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. In short, you learned how to count, argue, and read the stars. You know the basics needed to survive both theological debates and surprise comet sightings. Let's not sugarcoat it, students were not always thrilled. Medieval children, much like modern ones, did not wake up giddy about declensions. And discipline. Oh, it was robust. Think more stick than carrot. Some traveling teachers carried literal canes as if to say, "Welcome to class. Pain is part of the curriculum." But many teachers, to their credit, were passionate and profoundly patient. These were people who genuinely believed knowledge was sacred, even if their students smelled like hay and thought logic was a kind of soup. And the range of teaching quality. Astounding. On one end, you had brilliant minds passing down classical wisdom. On the other, some guy who once heard Cicero mentioned in a tavern and now claimed to be an expert. Today's lesson: how to pretend you're learned using big words and vague confidence. Now, why would someone become a traveling teacher in the first place? Let's break it down. Option A: you were a brilliant academic with no noble blood and no land. Teaching was your ticket out of the family cabbage farm. Option B: you were a failed monk exiled from the abbey for asking too many questions about the Trinity. Option C: you were just weirdly into grammar. Regardless, these folks had grit. They braved roads, riddled with thieves, slept in stables, and taught under leaky, thatched roofs, all for the chance to pass knowledge to the next generation of children who may or may not be poking a dead squirrel during class. And the students. They were a diverse bunch. Some were local noble kids whose parents wanted them literate enough to read land contracts. Others were peasant children who'd scraped together tuition with eggs and labor. Occasionally, a village would pool resources to fund a communal class where 10 children shared one quill and 4 shared comprehension. And let's talk supplies. You know that fresh paper smell we associate with school? Yeah, medieval education smelled more like parchment, goat hide, and disappointment. Books were rare, ink was expensive, and desks were imaginative. Flatstone's knees or the occasional pigsty wall all doubled as writing surfaces. And yet, despite the discomfort, learning happened. Bit by bit, letter by letter, kids learned to read, write, and occasionally challenge a local bishop to a logic duel. These traveling teachers didn't just spread knowledge, they laid the groundwork for what would one day become universities, public schools, and TikTok debates about punctuation. And here's where things get spicy. These teachers weren't always men. Records show that although rare, some women took up the chalk stick, or more likely the wax tablet, and taught in their communities. They taught reading herbal medicine and the vital art of not dying of ignorance. Progressive, maybe. Surprising, definitely. And their impact was real. Many of the thinkers we now celebrate, your Hildegards, your Aquinas, your Abelards, owed their early education not to royal tutors, but to dusty-footed scholars who believed the mind mattered more than mud-stained shoes. Of course, not everyone liked them. Local clergy sometimes saw them as competition. Nobles saw them as threats because an educated peasant is a peasant who asks questions. Even tavern owners complained because these teachers often paid in verses instead of coin. But they persisted. Year after year, village after village, they kept teaching. Rain or shine, war or plague. Through famines, invasions, and questionable tavern stew, they trudged forward. The medieval road scholar. Less Hogwarts, more hogpen. Less flying broomstick, more muddy sandals. But in their own unglamorous, ink-stained way, they were the real magic. So the next time your Wi-Fi cuts out during a Zoom class and you curse the modern education system, just remember there was once a man with no shoes, a single book, and a mule named Horace teaching grammar to pig farmers behind a dung cart. And somehow he made it work. Let's say you're a medieval sailor. You've just been handed a beautifully illustrated map by someone who smells faintly of ink and fish stew. It's got rivers, mountains, a few castles, a generous amount of decorative swirls, and what's this? A giant scaly beast with wings, horns, and a suspicious resemblance to your mother-in-law lounging just off the coast of Iceland. Congratulations, you found a dragon, or at least a cartographic warning sign that says, "Here be monsters," or in Latin, "Hic sunt dracones," which translates roughly to, "Maybe don't sail here unless you're into dying." Welcome to the whimsical, wild, and wildly inaccurate world of medieval map-making, a time when geography was 10% science, 90% storytelling, and 100% absolutely bonkers. You see, in an age before satellites, Google Earth, or even accurate compasses, maps were less about directions and more about declarations. A medieval map was a theological, political, zoological art piece designed as much to impress your guests as it was to actually help you get somewhere. That island over there might be real, might be allegorical. That sea monster off the coast could be a whale, could be a metaphor for sin, could be your cartographer's fever dream after eating bad eel. Nobody knew, and everyone was fine with that. And let's be clear, these dragons weren't limited to one type. Oh no. Medieval cartographers were equal opportunity monster depictors. You had your classic fire-breathing drake, yes, but also sea serpents, manticore whale hybrids, lion-fish horse conglomerations that looked like a kid's sticker book gone rogue. Many of them were drawn mid-attack, usually swallowing a ship because subtlety wasn't really a thing in 13th century geography. These creatures often served as warning labels. This part of the ocean may be full of terrifying sea creatures. Also possibly just full of storms, pirates, or people with different accents, same thing really. But there's more to it than just monster doodles. These dragons and beasts told a story of the known world versus the unknown. Medieval maps, especially the beautifully weird ones, like the Mappa Mundi, didn't aim for accuracy in the way we think of it today. They weren't navigation tools. They were cosmological blueprints. The earth was often drawn as a disk, with Jerusalem at the center east, at the top, because sunrise equals holy, and the rest of the world arranged like a divine pizza of chaos. Europe, neat. Africa, vaguely threatening. Asia, a realm of wonders, unicorns, and probably eternal life. And beyond the edges, creatures, beasts, literal question marks wearing scales. You can practically hear the cartographer muttering, "We don't know what's over there, so let's just slap a hydra on it and call it a day." Some maps even depicted dog-headed men, giants with no heads and faces in their chests, and tribes who allegedly walked around upside down because gravity worked differently in distant lands. Were these real? Of course not. But they were truth adjacent. You see, dragons weren't just fantasy. They were symbols of danger, wonder, and the limits of human knowledge. In a world where most people never traveled more than 10 miles from home, the unknown was terrifying, exciting, and definitely full of fangs. But it wasn't all fear-mongering. Sometimes map monsters were just excuses for cartographic flair. If you're a monk turned map maker stuck in a cold monastery with a bottle of ink and an imagination too big for your own robe, are you going to draw another coastline? Or are you going to sketch a mermaid wrestling a squid while riding a narwhal into battle? Exactly. These dragons were the medieval version of Photoshop filters. Can't verify it. Draw it anyway. But here's where it gets interesting. People actually believed in these things. Not all of them, of course. Some scholars were skeptical, even in the 12th century. But many sailors, nobles, and even kings accepted these beasts as real threats. Sea monsters were listed in bestiaries alongside real animals. Travel logs described encounters with krakens, the size of islands, and flying serpents that shot fire from their butts. Okay, maybe not the last part. Probably. And don't even get us started on the Alexander romance, where Alexander the Great literally fights dragons in India. Medieval readers ate this stuff up. So if you were a map maker, drawing a dragon wasn't an act of whimsy, it was a public service announcement. Turn back or get flambéed. Now, as exploration expanded in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance maps began to shed some of their scaly passengers, realism started winning over romance. Cartographers like Mercator brought in grids and latitude lines and boring stuff like accuracy. But the dragons didn't die. They simply migrated from maps to margins, from geography to heraldry, from fact to fable. Even today, when you look at old fantasy maps or ride through a Renaissance fair, you're seeing the ghosts of those medieval monsters. And fun fact, the phrase "here be dragons" actually only appears on one known historical map, the Hunt Lennox globe dated around 1503. The Latin reads HC SVNT Dracones. Everywhere else the monsters are there. Yes, but the phrase "that's more modern myth than medieval memo," which is kind of perfect, really, because that's what dragons on maps represent, the line between what we know and what we want to believe. They're not just warnings, they're invitations to explore, to imagine, to be gloriously, wonderfully wrong. So the next time your GPS fails you and you're stuck in a roundabout for the third time, take comfort. At least your map doesn't suggest you're about to be eaten by a sea beast. Probably.